you may need that, or if you have hip issues on one side that you don't on the other, and you find you can't squat symmetrically. So the stance is set. Now the squat itself. Let's say you're starting with the band assist or a body weight squat. What you're going to do to initiate the squat is you're going to start completely upright. The chest is up, the knees and hips are straight, and the body just forms a straight line. You're going to initiate the squat by breaking at the hips and knees, meaning bend your hips and knees simultaneously, and you're going to sit back as if you have a chair about a foot behind you and you need to reach back with your butt to sit on it. You're going to sit back, and this is going to cause your torso to come forward a bit. Now, there's a difference between excessive and a slight forward lean. We'll get into that more later, but essentially think about it this way. Your butt is going back, which means if you don't lean your chest forward a bit, you're going to fall backward. You need to fold into yourself. So the butt goes back, the chest leans forward a bit, and hey, if you're squatting body weight, you know, without any band assist, you may want to reach your hands forward so that they're parallel to the floor. So the hips go back, the knees bend, the torso shifts forward, and we get the crease of the hip, that ASIS, just below your kneecap or close to, and then we build so that you're able to get to that full depth. Once you've hit depth, you're going to drive through your heels, really drive through your whole foot, and you're going to straighten the knees and hips at the same time. In other words, we want your torso to remain at about the same angle until the last quarter of the squat, where you then straighten your torso out and come back to that vertical position, perpendicular to the floor. That's how a squat should go. Now, it's pretty tough because you're just listening to me. There's not really a visual aid here. But essentially, you don't want your butt shooting up early, and you don't want to scoop forward, meaning your knees drive forward on the way up, and you do this weird kind of worm motion. I don't know, some sort of weird dance move that maybe your friend taught you. But it should look smooth, and essentially you should probably know if it looks right or not. If it's really out of whack, it will look off. Now, with the band assist, you're going to need to make sure you lean forward, and you're going to have to think about that because it is very tempting to just lean back against the band, especially if you have a band giving you a lot of help. So make sure that you're leaning forward. Maybe you're keeping your hands on the band, you're holding on to that, but you're leaning forward and you're sitting your butt back. Now these details I'm sharing with you and the band assist have allowed me to help a number of people squat to full depth, including a lady that's in her early 70s and very deconditioned, had a really hard time getting up and down the stairs, and she's finding that they're much easier now, and she's almost to a full depth bodyweight squat now, I'm happy to report. So this stuff will work. It will definitely work for you if you put the time in. Now, what sort of issues should you be looking out for with your squat? Because there are a number of them, and they're all fairly common issues that I see quite frequently in the gym with the people that I work with. And we're always working on these. Myself, no matter how advanced you get, there's probably something that's going to come up every so often that you got to fix. And that's why you get a good coach. That's why you video your sets, and don't ever just assume that your form looks good, because most likely it's not, especially if you're pushing yourself a little bit at a time. When you start adding weight or adding reps or something like that, you've got to really be careful and watch your form constantly. So what are the big issues that I see? Well, I'm glad you asked. So one of the big issues is knee valgus. Now, I want you to picture yourself standing, or hey, stand up right now if you're in a room, you're not driving, do somewhere safe. Stand up, get your feet about shoulder width apart, and point your toes out 15 to 30 degrees. And notice where your kneecaps point. If you're doing it right, your kneecap should be pointing in the same direction as your toes. And when you squat, that should still be the case throughout the entire duration of the movement. But there is an issue that comes up quite frequently called knee valgus. This is where your knees collapse inward toward each other, toward the midline of the body. And so we want to make sure that the knees track the toes. They point in the same direction as the toes the entire time. If they point too far out or too far in, that's stress. That's extra stress on one side or the other of the knee, and that you could risk wearing the cartilage down more on one side of the knee, or you could risk some sort of injury or tweak, something like that. So you need to be mindful. Now, there's several different ways you can go about fixing this, and the first thing, whenever you're going to fix some sort of issue when it comes to your lifting or your movement, is to try to correct your technique first. What I mean by that is, don't try to go and start doing a bunch of fancy, weird exercises on the floor to fix it. But first, see if, hey, you can maybe just drop the weight a little bit and just think about it. Focus on correcting the form first before you try to do corrective exercises or see a PT about this stuff. Because oftentimes all you need to do is just back off on the weight and bring some attention, bring some focus to the issue that you're dealing with. So, fixing knee valgus, as you squat, make sure your knees stay out. Make sure they stay in alignment with your toes. Most of the time in the gym, you'll find that the squat racks are in front of a mirror, and this is great because you can watch yourself in the mirror. It's not just for admiring your glutes or your biceps or whatever. You can also use it to check your form. So as you're squatting, look at yourself in the mirror. Make sure those knees are pointing out the same direction as your toes, not collapsing inward. And what you can think about as you come out of the bottom, which is generally where it happens, most of the time it happens as you start to come back up, is pushing or shoving your knees out away from the midline of your body, meaning the midline, like your nose and just the center of your body. You can also think about squeezing your butt as tight as you can, which is what you should be doing when you squat or deadlift or do most movements, especially when it comes to the lower body, because the glutes are hip extensors, meaning they drive your hips forward when you're standing up out of the squat, and they also rotate the hips out. And oftentimes when you're dealing with knee valgus, it's because maybe those external rotators of the hip are weak, or they're just not being used properly. So you can think about squeezing your butt, you can think about driving your knees out, and then finally you can also think about grabbing the floor with your toes. Because sometimes knee valgus is a result of flat feet or a collapsed arch. It could also be an ankle issue. But if it's that issue, if it's an issue of the arch or the foot, digging the toes, especially the big toe, and grabbing the floor, don't do it to the point where the very ends of your toes are on the floor or in your shoe, but think about just grabbing the floor and engaging those toes. And you'll feel your whole leg if you do it right. Your legs will kind of rotate out slightly without actually pivoting the feet, but the hip, the knee, they'll kind of go out a little. So think about also grabbing the floor if the other corrections I talked about don't help, like driving the knees out. So that's one of the main issues. Now that I've beaten that one like a dead horse, let's move on to the next one, which is an excessive forward lean of the body. The torso is leaning forward too much. Now this can happen. This can occur especially if you're using too much weight too soon. Essentially what's happening here is your legs are maybe a little bit weaker, and so your back tries to bear more of the weight that's on the bar. And so, again, one of the first things you should do is to drop the weight, go lower so you don't worry about the weight as much, but you can think about correcting your form. If the weight's too heavy, you're going to think about the weight, not your form, predominantly. So you need to drop the weight, 10 pounds, 20 pounds, 50 pounds, whatever it is you need to do. Make sure that weight's light enough so you can do it properly. So, what's the cue I use most often for an issue like this? Chest up. Chest up. So yes, there is a lean forward of the torso like we talked about, but we don't want to be folded in half. Your torso should never be parallel to the floor. So keep your chest up, which what that does is it extends the upper back and it allows you to stay more vertical. And this goes into probably the most important thing you need to think about when you squat, which is the bar should stay over the middle of your foot. So if I were to watch you from the side and you were to do a full squat, the bar should move in a straight line all the way down to the bottom and all the way back up to the top. If the bar shifts forward, and there's a good chance that you're either coming up onto your toes, your heels are off the ground, or your torso is leaning forward way too much. And if that happens, you have to travel a longer distance to do the squat because now you have a curve in the bar and you're having to travel further like that. And there's a lot more stress on the body, in particular on the back. So from watching from the side, the bar should move in a straight line directly over the middle of your foot, keeping the chest up and getting to full depth. And again, if you can't do that, you need to drop that weight down and you need to start over and make sure that it looks perfect every time. Video your form. Set up your phone on a shelf or something off to the side of you and watch it. Have a friend watch you. But that bar needs to stay over the middle of the foot. That is where you can lift the weight most efficiently and you can lift the most weight, period. The next one is a hip shift. This is when your hips shift to one side or the other. I had a big problem with this for several years myself. Squatting was horrible because I was pushing the weight too heavy and I was shifting my hips to one side. My knees were collapsing. It was a train wreck. And so I had to check my ego at the door for a while. And I brought my weight down by like 70, 80 pounds, I believe. And I slowly worked my way back up and making sure every single rep was perfect. Every single rep, I was using both my legs equally and my hips weren't shifting, my knees weren't collapsing in. And so that's probably the best way you can go about fixing that issue is just by lightening the weight up. Now there are other ways as well, including maybe doing a squat with one leg elevated. But again, my experience anyway, that with what helped the most was just lightening that load up for a month or two and slowly adding 5 pounds maybe each time I went in to squat again. There's a lot of different corrective exercises you could probably find on YouTube or through a physical therapist, but that's what my personal experience gave me. And then finally, over rounding or arching the back, so hunching over or hyperextending the back. These are both issues that I've seen. The former being the more common one. So rounding. So in particular, the lower back. Let's start there because the lower back, we know we want to keep that neutral or quote unquote straight. But really what we want is a neutral spine because the spine has curves. Okay, it has curves in the lower back, the upper, and then the neck area. It curves, and we want to keep it neutral, not necessarily straight. So rounding the back happens often when someone gets low.